If you're a monitor manufacturer, you may not know it yet, but you've got a target on your back because Innocn is coming for you. You may not have heard of this company, but they make all kinds of monitors and they're pretty good at it. They make little portable ones, they make big, huge ones, and they make more mid-sized ones like this one behind me. I'm Chris Wook, this is reviews from makeuseof.com, and that is the Innocn 27M2V mini LED 4K gaming monitor. Now it does a whole lot right and just a little bit wrong. Is that wrong enough to keep this from being the perfect gaming monitor for you? It depends, but that is exactly what we are here to figure out. One look at the silvery chassis of the 27M2V, and you might imagine that it's made out of aluminum, but it's not. It's made from plastic. There are a few reasons for this, but the main one is to keep the price down. Affordability is one of the key selling points of this monitor, and using aluminum for the build would bring the price up without really adding too much in the way of actual functionality. Using a plastic build lets them keep the price down and focus more on the parts that matter to you, like the actual display panel. Now, just because the monitor is made out of plastic doesn't mean they decided to go full bare bones, because if you turn it around and look at the back of it, hey, it's got lights. I don't really know why it has lights, but it's got lights and you can change the color of them if you want. Strangely enough, this isn't the type of ambient light you find on TVs that are meant to help reduce eye strain in dark rooms by making the wall behind the TV the same color that's on the screen. Instead, you just get a kind of light show coming out of the back of it. You might be able to adjust that to ambient modes, but I didn't find it in the current firmware that's on this monitor. Now, if you care to take a look under the monitor, that's where you'll find all the ports. We're gonna get into these in depth later, but that's a nice location. You'll also find the buttons in pretty much the same place along the front bottom right of the monitor. That's where it is on a lot of old school monitors, and these are slightly fiddly, we'll look at that more later, but the buttons are easy enough to reach. A lot of monitors use separate mounts for the included stand or a VESA mount if you want to wall mount it, for example. This takes a slightly different tactic because the stand attaches right where that VESA mount is. It's a handy way of attaching. All you have to do is hold down a clip, slot the stand in, and you're good to go. The stand also has a bunch of adjustability, which is a great feature for this monitor. Looking at tilt, you can tilt it forward or backwards by 15 degrees. That's enough to get to pretty much any comfortable viewing angle. You can also raise or lower the height. There's up to 120 millimeters of travel, just like a mountain bike. Now, the great thing about the 120 meters of adjustability here is just how easy it is. All you have to do is pull down or push up, and you can adjust the monitor without much effort. Yeah, it was a little weird behind my back there, but still, I was able to do it behind my back without breaking eye contact with you. Nice hat, by the way. I've seen this in a couple different monitors, and it remains my favorite way to adjust the height of a monitor. There's no other things to secure. It's just easy, and most of the time it works perfectly. Yeah, if you go to lift up the monitor to move it across the room, it's gonna raise all the way up, but you just plop it down on a desk and lower it back down. Now, this monitor doesn't just tilt, it actually rotates, but not enough that you can get it into portrait mode without taking it off the stand. You actually don't have to take it off the stand, but you do have to lay the monitor down on its face, preferably on something that isn't gonna hurt the display, and then kind of pull the stand back and rotate it around. You might be able to do this with the monitor still standing up, but I wasn't able to find a way that didn't feel like I was about to break it. Of course, maybe you're just really into Dutch angles and you want to look at your monitor like this all day. Maybe you woke up one morning and your neck's kind of janked from sleeping wrong. This will fit perfectly. Now let's look at something a little more fun, the ports. On the bottom of the monitor, you get a pair of HDMI ports, both 48 gigabit per second, which means you can plug in your PlayStation 5 and your Xbox Series X and still have room to plug in your gaming PC via the DisplayPort with DSC port. Of course, that's not the only way you can plug in either, because this also supports DP-Alt or DisplayPort alternate over USB-C. And there's a pair of USB-A ports on there, letting this act as kind of a hub/monitor. So if you've got a pretty bare bones setup and you just want to plug your laptop in and maybe a hard drive or two or a keyboard, this is a perfect way to do it without having to plug in anything else. Of course, using that on-screen display to switch between the various inputs is a little trickier than it could be, but we'll look at that a little later on. You also get a 3.5mm audio output on the bottom. You can use that for headphones or to run to other speakers. This monitor does have speakers built in. We'll look at that later, but as you might imagine, they're not the best. Setting up the 27M2V is pretty easy. Basically, all you need to do is find a spot to put it, attach the stand to it, plop it down, plug some things in, and you're good to go. Of course, there are a few things worth mentioning. The first is the depth, or the footprint, which is about 10 inches deep, as you can see on the desk behind me. Now that footprint isn't actually too big, but it is worth keeping in mind if you're thinking about putting this on a shelf or an unusually narrow desk. In that case, ditch the built-in stand and wall mount it. You'll be much better off. One final thing about setup worth mentioning is that HDR isn't enabled by default, but it is easy to turn on. Just open the on-screen display, go down to game settings, HDR, and then set that to standard and you're good to go. After that, you can toggle HDR via Windows or whatever operating system you're using. On Windows, it's Windows Shift B, and you can toggle HDR quite easily, way easier than having to turn it on and off in the monitor. Looking at the controls, I already alluded to this, but these are straight out of the 90s when it comes to unfun to use controls. You get up and down arrows to navigate the menus, and no matter what you're doing, they always feel like they should be reversed. Down always goes up and up always goes down. I don't know why, but that is how it happens. Even worse, the function of the buttons can actually change, so you have to look at the on-screen display to figure out which button is going to do what, not the actual buttons themselves down below or the guide on the monitor. Granted, you don't have to use the OSD that often, so this shouldn't be too much of a headache, but a joystick layout or something slightly more intuitive like that would have gone a long way towards making this a little bit more usable. Speaking of usability, one handy feature here is an auto brightness sensor located on top of the monitor. That can automatically adjust the brightness based on how bright or dim the room you're in is. Now this can be pretty sensitive. I noticed just typing that it would wobble the monitor enough that I'd notice the brightness going up and down ever so slightly to the point that I turned it off. If, on the other hand, you have your computer set somewhere where it's in the shade part of the day and then in the sun another part of the day, that auto brightness feature could come in very handy for you. Now let me speak to the gamers for a second. You're hardcore, I get it. You don't trust in-game crosshairs. You trust in-monitor crosshairs, and you want to know, does this have one? Yes, it does. It also, oddly enough, has a refresh rate monitor built in, kind of like the frame rate counter you'll see in games. It is handy for reasons I'll point out later on. Looking at the display panel itself, you get a resolution of 3840 by 2160, as is typical for a 4K monitor, and they claim the contrast ratio is 1000 to 1. That's not quite OLED, but it's still pretty good. Turning to brightness, you get 1200 nits of peak brightness and an average max brightness around 600 nits. For refresh rate, you get a bunch of choices, and by a bunch, I actually mean 3, except the third option is variable. So you get 60 Hertz, 120 Hertz, and then variable refresh rate, which is enabled via AMD FreeSync. You can turn that on in game settings in the OSD as well. Now looking at the blacks, they don't get as full deep black as you would expect from an OLED, but they get awfully close, similar to a quantum dot LED display. Now looking at accuracy, this is not the most accurate out of the box. The colors look great, and for gaming and anything like that, it's wonderful, but it isn't quite accurate enough for serious content creation, video, or photo work. That said, if you have access to a colorimeter, you can set this up pretty accurately. So if you want to use this for work, you can. It's just going to take a little extra effort on your part. Now you probably can't see this too well behind me because of the lights that are aimed at me at the moment, but this display doesn't have any issues with backlight bleed, at least the model I'm looking at. But they sell it as a gaming monitor, so what about gaming? What about response times? Well, they claim a response time of 1 millisecond, but that's massaged a little bit because they use response time overdrive modes. You get 4 settings. You get off, normal, fast, and ultra fast. Depending on the type of gaming you're doing and the frame rates involved, either normal or fast should be all you ever need. I never found a reason to go up to ultra fast, and I just ended up with some overshoot heading in the other direction, and I really didn't like the way that felt. Fast was even too much at times, depending on frame rates. Normal was always fine. Even on off, the response times are good enough that I never perceived noticeable input lag. Maybe I'm just really bad at that though. Now, I mentioned AMD FreeSync, but not G-Sync, and this is not an officially G-Sync certified monitor. That said, I've heard reports of people successfully using it with G-Sync, but I was not able to get G-Sync working. That was probably because I was using a laptop and things get a little fussy there. Now, talking about variable refresh rate, you do get the capabilities to go up to as high as 160 Hertz, but in my testing, I never actually saw that number. Every time it topped out at 144 Hertz. I don't know why, but I'm not the only person I've heard of having that issue. It could be a compatibility thing, but just don't expect to necessarily get that 160 because it's a little less attainable than 144, which should still be good enough for a whole lot of people. Looking at actual games, I tried a bunch of stuff, but you don't want to know about my backlog. You want to know about new games. So I played Diablo 4 and I played Exoprimal. Both of the games felt very smooth. Diablo 4 moved incredibly smoothly, as did Exoprimal. And honestly, it was the kind of experience where I forgot I was reviewing the monitor and just started having fun and kind of being wowed by the experience, which I think is some of the highest praise I can give here. I stopped being clinical and just started having a good time. Of course, then I immediately stopped having a good time because I had to listen to the speakers. Dun dun dun. Seriously though, is anybody expecting the speakers on a 27-inch monitor to sound good? There's nowhere to put a good speaker in there, and there's nowhere for sound to reverberate either. What do you expect? Yes, you can get sound out of it, and it's better to have speakers and not need them than it is to need them and not have them. Just don't expect all that much out of these because I couldn't even really notice too much stereo separation. It sounded like one big mono speaker. I'm sure there are two in there. They just didn't do a whole lot of stereo. Now let's be serious, this is not exactly a cheap monitor, but for what it is and what it does, it's about as cheap gets, at least at the moment. Yeah, Innocn had to make some sacrifices, and I think they sacrificed in the right areas. A plastic build, weak speakers, controls that aren't great but you rarely need to use. They're all things I think most people can live with. The panel's impressive, the colors are great, and if you want to, you can calibrate it to be a work-worthy monitor. Whether or not this is the perfect monitor for you is going to depend on your use case. Do you absolutely need a 160 or higher refresh rate? You might have a trickier time getting it here. If you're cool with 144 though, you're gonna love this thing and you're gonna have a great time with it. If you're looking at this monitor and you think it's for you, it probably is. And I don't imagine you're gonna regret the purchase. And that about wraps it up for this one. For specs and more hard data, check out the article that I wrote as a companion to this video over at makeuseof.com. We'll put a link down in the description. Thank you to Innocn for providing the review unit, and most of all, as always, thank you for watching.